My name is Dusty Emerson, and I was 34 years old when my heart tore itself open in the hallway of the hospital where I worked. While a surgeon I knew by name opened my chest, the front desk dialed my parents, and my sister answered the phone at a brunch cafe. She listened to the words emergency heart surgery, and she said she's not our problem anymore. Then she hung up, ordered another round, and posted a family selfie captioned, "Living our best life." My dad never asked what happened, not that week, not once. For 3 weeks, I thought that silence was the whole story. Then my aunt walked into my recovery room carrying one thin envelope, and I learned my family hadn't just abandoned me. They had been billing me my entire life. What I did with that envelope and with the $38,000 check my mother would eventually slide across her tablecloth, none of them saw coming. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where the people who were supposed to love you become the story you survived. If a family ever made you feel like a debt instead of a daughter, this one is for you. Drop a comment. Tell me where you're listening from, and be sure to subscribe because you're going to want to know what was inside that envelope. It happened on a Tuesday in March at 6:47 inches, the evening, 1 hours and 47 minutes into my shift on the cardiac ICU. I remember the time because I was charting it for a patient when the pain hit me instead. It started behind my breastbone and ripped upward into my jaw, sharp and tearing like something structural giving way. I had described that exact pain to nursing students 100 times. Hearing my own lecture come back at me from inside my own chest is a special kind of irony. I set down the tablet. I took my own pulse, thy fast wrong, 11 years on that unit, and my first thought was still professional. This presentation is not a heart attack. This is worse. Maya Torres, our charge nurse and my best friend of a decade, caught me before I hit the floor. I heard her call it overhead, heard the word dissection, heard the unit I loved turn all of its terrible machinery toward me. They cut my scrub top off with the shears I kept in my own pocket. Somebody's hands were on my sternum. Somebody's voice was counting, and the ceiling tiles I had stared past for 1 years went by overhead like highway lines. An aortic dissection kills half the people it touches before they ever reach a table. I knew the number. I had quoted the number. The last thing I heard was my own monitor alarming. That high, insistent tone I had answered for other people my entire adult life. The last thing I thought was not a prayer and not a memory. It was a question simple and ridiculous. Someone should call who? I couldn't finish the sentence before the anesthesia finished it for me. Here is something most people don't know, and I only know because it's my job. When you are dying on a gurney, nobody waits for your family's permission to save you. 2 physicians signed the emergency consent while the O team scrubbed in, which is exactly how the law is built to work. My family could not have stopped that surgery, and to be clear, they never got the chance to try, but the hospital still has to notify your next of kin. It's policy, it's decency, and it's a computer field, and that computer field is where my past caught up with me. 3 years earlier, I had scrubbed my family out of my life like a wound. New emergency contacts in my phone, new beneficiary on my retirement account. I'd even done a will, which my lawyer said was unusual for a healthy 31-year-old. I thought I'd found every door they could walk back through and locked it. What I never thought about was a patient file from 7 years ago, from the night I'd had my appendix out at my own hospital, back when I was 27 and still went home for Christmas. That old admission listed my mother, Carol Emerson, as next of kin with her cell number. And when I rolled in unconscious, the intake system reached for the most recent family contact it had. Nobody did anything wrong. The nurse who made that call followed the same procedure I'd followed 1,000 times. That is the part that still gets me. There was no villain in the first hour, just a database doing its job. So somewhere between the 6th floor and the operating room, while a machine took over my circulation, a phone on a brunch table in Bangor started to ring. I wasn't awake for the call, obviously. Maya made it, and Maya told me every detail exactly once months later at my kitchen table because I asked her to, and because she doesn't lie to me. The phone rang 4 times. A young woman answered, and there was music behind her and the clink of glasses and somebody laughing. Maya asked for Carol Emerson. This is her daughter. The voice said, "Who's this?" Maya identified herself, said the words. No family is supposed to hear emergency surgery, heart critical, and asked how quickly someone could come. She said there was a pause, maybe 3 seconds, long enough that she thought the line had dropped. Then my sister Brianna, 30 years old, mother of two, said, "She's not our problem anymore," and hung up. Maya stood there holding the receiver, looking at it like it had bitten her. She called back straight to voicemail, declined, not missed. So she tried the second number in the old file, my father's cell. It rang twice and cut off in the middle of the third ring, which is what a phone does when someone looks at the screen and presses the button. Frank Emerson, the man who taught me to drive, who I'd watched cry at his own mother's funeral, looked at the hospital's number while his daughter was on bypass and put his phone back in his pocket. Maya didn't tell the surgical team any of this. She just wrote family notified in the record because technically it was true, and then she went into the supply room and, in her words, rearranged it violently for 10 minutes. Nobody from my family called back that night. Nobody called the next day or the day after that or the week after that. I woke up on day 2 with a tube in my throat and a stranger's handwriting on my dry erase board. And my first coherent emotion was embarrassment. Nurses make terrible patients. Ask anyone. By day 3, I was excited and trying to read my own monitor upside down. And by day 4, the ICU staff, my people, my coworkers, had threatened to tape a towel over the screen. It's funny until it isn't. Every skill I had, every version of myself I respected, lived on the other side of that bed rail, and I had been carried across it in one afternoon. Maya sat with me through her days off. She did my laundry. She smuggled in decent coffee and lied about it to the nutritionist. And on day 5, when I finally asked the question out loud, "Did anyone call back?" she looked at the ceiling and said, "Maybe the numbers were old. Maybe they didn't understand how serious it was. She is a wonderful nurse and a terrible liar." I had watched her deliver hard truths to families for 10 years, and I knew what her face did when the truth was undeliverable. I didn't push. Some part of me had already done the math. Here is the thing about people like me: the strong ones, the reliable ones, the ones who show up. Being needed was the only way I had ever known how to exist inside my family. Now I was the one who needed for the first time in my whole life. And the answer had come back: silence. On day 6, a discharge planner handed me a form and asked gently if I wanted to update my emergency contact information. I stared at those 2 blank lines for a long time. I couldn't fill them in yet. To explain how I got here, I have to take you back to a yellow kitchen in Hartland, Maine, that smelled like percolator coffee and dish soap. My grandmother, Grandma Margaret Emerson, on her church envelopes, raised my father in that house, and then when her heart began to fail, needed somebody to help her stay in it. I was 22, fresh out of nursing school, 40 minutes away in Bangor. My parents lived 12 minutes from her. My mother had opinions about who should handle it, and she delivered them the way she delivered everything, smiling with her hand on my shoulder. Family takes care of family, Dusty. So for 5 years, from 22 to 27, I drove out after my shifts and on my days off. I managed Graham's medications, cooked her low-sodium meals. She pretended to hate, fought with her insurance company on speakerphone, while she made faces at me across the table. My mother supervised from a distance. Brianna was still finding herself, which apparently required brunch. And I want to be honest with you, I'm not sorry I did it. Graham was the best company of my life. She was the only person in that family who ever looked at me and asked, "And who's taking care of you, honeybee?" On the back of one of her prescription printouts, we once sketched a floor plan together, a little cardiac rehab clinic for people out in the county, the kind of place that would have saved her 10 years of decline. She drew flower boxes on it. I still have that piece of paper a few weeks before she died. She took my hand and said something I filed away as medication talking. "I set something aside for you, honeybee. If it ever goes missing, ask Ruth." Now the cutoff, 3 years before my surgery. 2 things happened in the same month, and my family's story machine turned them into a single verdict. First, my father needed a knee replacement, and my mother announced, not asked, that I would be taking a semester off from my nurse practitioner program to move home and manage his recovery. It's one semester, Dusty. Family takes care of family, I said no. But hear what my no actually looked like, because this matters. I built him a recovery plan the way I'd build one for any patient I loved. I hired a home health aide out of my own pocket for the first month, 3 visits a week. I printed his physical therapy schedule and taped it inside the kitchen cabinet. I drove out on my day off to set up his medication organizer. What I would not do was detonate the career I had built alone with dollar. 61,000 inches student loans that I was still paying off to become an unpaid live-in nurse for a man with a working wife and a healthy adult daughter, 12 minutes away. Second thing, same month, Brianna asked me to co-sign the mortgage on a 4-bedroom house she couldn't afford. I said no to that too, softly with apologies I didn't owe. My mother's verdict came down at Sunday dinner in front of my aunt and 2 cousins. Delivered like a court ruling, selfish. That was the whole trial. Within a year, I was gone from the Christmas card photo, gone from the group chat, gone from the wedding invitations of cousins I had babysat. Here's the twist I didn't appreciate until much later. I was the one who got cut off. But everyone in H. Heartland heard that I left. The selfie found me on discharge day. Maya was scrolling her phone while I signed paperwork, and she went still in a way that made me reach over and turn the screen toward me before she could decide to protect me. There they were. My mother, my father, Brianna, and her husband, Scott, 4 mimosas lifted toward the camera at a window table. My mother's lipstick was perfect. My father was mid-laugh, a laugh I hadn't heard in 3 years. The caption read, "Living our best life." The timestamp put it 90 minutes after Maya's call, after "She's not our problem anymore." After my father declined the second ring, while a machine breathed for me, they ordered another round and documented their joy for 41 likes. I want to tell you, I felt rage. What I actually felt was colder and quieter, like a door I'd been holding open for 3 years, finally clicking shut on its own weight. I didn't comment. I didn't screenshot it and send it to a cousin with a caption of my own. I turned the phone face down and finished signing my discharge papers, and I'm asking you to remember that choice because it becomes important later. What I took home instead was arithmetic. 8 weeks of no paycheck, a tuition installment for my NP program due in 6, and the clinic fund, the little account where Graham's flower box floor plan was supposed to someday live, sitting at a number so far from enough that I laughed out loud alone in my apartment. If you've ever watched your family toast their best life while you learn to walk to your own mailbox again, tell me in the comments what you did with that silence. And if you're new here, subscribe because you'll want to see what came next, because that first Saturday home, somebody knocked on my door. It wasn't my mother. Aunt Ruth stood in my doorway holding a casserole dish like a shield. Ruth Emerson is my father's older sister, 68 years old, retired postmaster of H. Heartland. Maine, a woman who spent 40 years sorting other people's mail and 1 lifetime keeping her own family's letters unopened. She never married. She drives a Buick the color of weak tea, and she does not hug so much as briefly install you against her shoulder. She walked into my apartment, set the casserole on the stove, and started doing things. She threw out the expired yogurt. She watered the 1 plant Maya's rotation had missed. She found my pill organizer and studied my new medication list through her readers, nodding like it was a parcel with correct postage. And here is what she did not do. She did not ask why I hadn't called my mother. She did not say, "You know how your sister is." She did not audition excuses for anybody. 3 years of exile had taught me that every conversation with an Emerson came with a collections notice attached. Ruth just handed me a fork and told me the casserole needed salt, and she'd made it anyway because salt was apparently trying to kill me. I could have cried over that fork. I didn't quite. But twice that afternoon, I caught her hand drifting to her coat pocket where the corner of something stiff and paper-colored peeked out. An envelope, thick folded, soft at the edges like it had been carried a long time. Twice she touched it. Twice she pulled her hand back. When she left, she stood in my doorway a moment too long, looking at me the way you look at a package you're not sure is ready for delivery. And she said quietly, mostly to herself, "Not yet." She came back Wednesday with soup, and that was the day I learned what my father said. Ruth had been at my parents' house the afternoon of my surgery, dropping off seed cataloges. She was standing in the kitchen when Brianna's call came through. My sister had phoned my mother from the cafe, laughing the way you'd report a telemarketer. "Some nurse says Dusty's having heart surgery." I told her she's not our problem anymore. Ruth said my mother wiped the counter twice and said the hospital was probably being dramatic. That hospitals always are. And my father, Frank Emerson, sat at the table he has sat at for 40 years, looked at his coffee, and asked one question. Not, "Is she alive?" Not, "Which hospital?" he asked. "Is it going to cost us anything?" Ruth told me this with her hands folded, watching me take it, the way I watch patients take a diagnosis. And I'll tell you what I told her. There is a kind of hurt that skips crying entirely and goes straight to arithmetic. My sister's line was cruelty, and cruelty is at least whether loud, stupid, survivable. My father's question was a ledger entry. Somewhere in that man's chest, his daughter on an operating table had been filed under expenses. I asked Ruth why that question? Why the silence after? Why a man who once drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to fix my furnace couldn't dial a phone? Ruth looked at me for a long moment, and her jaw worked and her hand went to that coat pocket again and stopped. "Your father doesn't ask questions he already knows the answers to," she said. "Remember that." She wouldn't say another word about it. She washed the soup pot and left me alone with the sentence. Weeks 3 through 5, I learned to be carried, and I was terrible at it. Recovery from open heart surgery is a full-time job with a sadistic supervisor. You walk the hallway hugging a pillow to your chest, so your own sternum doesn't argue with you. You sleep sitting up. You cry at supermarket commercials because your body has decided feelings live in your incision. Now, through all of it, my apartment ran like a small, warm conspiracy. Maya had made a schedule, an actual laminated schedule, to my refrigerator. And the day shift signed up in ink. Soup on Mondays from Priya, rides to cardiology on Thursdays from Big Tom, who drove like he was transporting organs. 4 names on that sheet by the end. And if you counted the last names, not one of them was Emerson, except the 68-year-old with the Buick, who took every Sunday and defended it territorially. I kept trying to pay them back. I ordered pizza to the unit twice, started a thank you spreadsheet, tried to reimburse Priya for groceries until she threatened to bill me for emotional damages. Maya finally sat me down on my own couch, pointed at the fridge, and said, "You don't owe us." That's the whole point of us. I heard it. I didn't believe it yet. 34 years of training doesn't come out with the chest tubes. But I heard it, and something in me shifted an inch on its foundation. That Friday, an envelope arrived in my actual mailbox. The first contact from my mother in 3 years, cream-colored, my name in her careful penmanship, a return address sticker with a cardinal on it. I stood in the lobby holding it, and my hands were steadier than they had any right to be. It was a Get Well card, glossy store brand, a watercolor lighthouse on the front. The printed sentiment inside wishing me smooth sailing back to health. It was signed the Emersons, not Mom, not Love. The Emersons like a return address, like a firm. And underneath in my mother's handwriting was the actual message, the reason the card existed. "Hope you're mending. Katie's baptism is next month at St. John's. The whole family will be there. We'd appreciate you not making things awkward. No need for everyone to hear the details of your situation. It's a happy day, Mom. I read it 3 times and I want to walk you through what it actually said, because my mother is fluent in a language it took me 30 years to translate. Your situation, my heart tearing open, was a detail. The baptism was the event, and my survival was above all a public relations problem to be managed before it could leak into the pews of St. John's and complicate the story H. Hartland had been told. The one where I'm the selfish daughter who abandoned her family. She wasn't checking on me. She was performing crisis containment on me. But it was the postscript that told me everything I needed to know about the brunch table. Tucked at the bottom, small, almost cheerful. "P.S. Your sister was only joking. You know how she is." I set the card down very carefully, the way you set down an instrument you're tempted to throw. They knew the call, the words, all of it. It had been discussed at some kitchen table meeting, weighed and dressed in a punchline. My family had held a story conference about my surgery, and the version they approved didn't require anyone to visit. Week 5, my heart threw a tantrum. Atrial fibrillation, common after cardiac surgery, usually harmless, always terrifying. It happened at 2 inches the morning, that fluttering wrongness, like a bird panicking behind my ribs. And I did the thing I make patients promise to do. I called instead of waiting. They kept me overnight for monitoring. And there is a particular loneliness to lying in a telemetry bed at 3 o'clock a.m. Listening to your own irregular heartbeat translated into beeps, doing the thought experiment I'd been avoiding for 5 weeks. If this had been the big one, if the machine had drawn a straight line, the hospital would have dialed that same brunch table again. My mother would have wiped the counter. My father would have asked his one question, and the last official act of my life would have been interrupting mimosas. The rhythm settled by morning. Something else didn't. At 9 o'clock a.m., still in the telemetry unit's paper socks, I asked for the forms, all of them. I signed a healthcare proxy naming Maya Tor as my medical decision maker. I updated the next of kin field in the hospital system myself, with the registrar watching to Ruth Emerson, Aunt. I changed the contact card in my wallet, the sticker inside my phone case, the form at my dentist of all places. Erasing your family from a form takes about 4 minutes. It took me 34 years to earn those 4 minutes. And I want to be precise about what they were. Not revenge, not a tantrum, a correction. The record now matched reality. Whoever the system called next time would actually come. I was home by noon, and at 4 o'clock my phone rang. Ruth, her voice careful in a way I'd never heard it. Are you strong enough yet? Because I think it's time I brought you that envelope. She came the next morning and set it on my kitchen table, and for a moment neither of us touched it. It was an ordinary envelope gone soft with years, the flap tucked, not sealed, and on the front in handwriting I hadn't seen since the funeral. That upright, trembling school teacher script was just my name. Dusty. She gave it to me the winter before she passed, Ruth said. She told me, hold it until the girl needs it. Not wants it, needs it. Ruth pulled out a chair and sat with her purse on her lap like a woman at a bus stop. I'd say a torn aorta qualifies. I'm sorry I waited 3 weeks. I wanted you strong first. Inside were 2 things. The first was a letter, several pages, folded in thirds, Graham's script marching across them. The second was a single sheet, older, creased into quarters like it had lived in a pocket. And it was not in Graham's handwriting. It was in my father's. I know my father's handwriting the way you know a voice in the dark from birthday cards, from permission slips, from the note he left in my first car. Check your oil, love, Dad. This sheet had a date at the top, 12 years old. It said, borrowed from mother's fund, set aside for Dusty schooling, $38,000. Will repay in full, and it was signed in blue ink, F.E. I read it twice. The room got very quiet. The way a room does when furniture you've sat on your whole life turns out to be evidence. Ruth watched me and said gently, you were never not their problem child. You were their credit line. My hands have held dying hearts steady, literally inside open chests. They shook now. The letter, Graham's letter, was still sitting there, unread. I read the letter out loud because Ruth said Graham would have wanted a voice on it, and mine was the one available. My honeybee, it began. If Ruth has given you this, something has gone wrong, and I am sorry I'm not there to make coffee while you're mad about it. Then she told the story plainly, the way she did everything. In 2010, she had set aside $38,000, her teacher's pension savings, the money from selling her sister's lake lot, earmarked for my nursing school, so I could, as she wrote, start your life without a stone on your back. She trusted my father to manage it because he was her son and because trusting him was easier than fighting my mother. By 2013, the money was gone. She found out by accident from a bank statement. When she confronted them, my mother didn't even flinch. Graham quoted her, and I could hear the voice rising off the paper. Dusty doesn't need it. She got loans, Brianna's wedding, can't wait. And Frank needs a dependable truck, a wedding I danced at. $22,000. A pickup my father still drives. 16,000 Graham was too sick by then to claw it back through lawyers. What she had the strength to do was sit her son down and make him write out what he'd taken and sign it. And she mailed her conscience to Ruth for safekeeping. The last page was for me. Love that keeps a ledger isn't love. Honeybee, don't you ever sign one? I sat with that sentence while the coffee went cold. 9 years I spent paying off $61,000 in student loans. 9 years of night differentials and skipped vacations. While the money meant to spare me all of it, bought a reception hall and a Ford. 3 years ago, they didn't cut me off for refusing to give. They cut me off because looking at meant seeing the invoice. That night, I built the bomb. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I photographed my father's note under the kitchen light, cropped it clean, and drafted the message to the extended family group chat I hadn't been welcome in for 3 years. 41 Emersons, the same audience that got the brunch selfie. I wrote it cold and factual, dates and figures, no adjectives. My thumb hovered over send for a long time, understand what that button was. For 3 years, my mother has owned the story of me in that town. One tap and I'd own it instead. Every casserole lady at St. John's would know what the Emersons' money problems actually looked like. It would have felt like oxygen. And then, sitting there at 2 a.m. in my quiet kitchen, I heard it. Not Graham's voice, mine saying a true thing I didn't want. Their whole power is the story. If I grab the story, I'm just the new Carol. Same courtroom, new judge, and the other road was just as useless. A 12-year-old handwritten note between a dead woman and her son. A lawyer would wins. And anyway, court wasn't what I needed. What I needed, and I say this as a woman who spent 5 years learning it the hard way, was to stop holding receipts at all. I deleted the message. I put the note and the letter in my nightstand drawer, not as a weapon, as a compass. Ruth was pulling on her coat to leave when she stopped at the door and I saw her decide to say it. One more thing you should know. Your father's been having chest pains for a year. Won't see anybody about it. Carol says prayer works fine. She let herself out and I stood there, a cardiac nurse with a drawer full of the truth, listening to that sentence tick. Week 8, they cleared me for part-time work. Not the ICU yet, my sternum and my cardiologist agreed. So they placed me in cardiac rehab, the sunny gym on the first floor, where survivors relearn their own bodies 3 mornings a week. I'd always thought of rehab as the gentle wing. It isn't. It's the honest wing. Everything that broke you is still in the room. You just walk on a treadmill next to it. My second Tuesday there, I met a woman in her 70s, post-bypass, who did her entire session watching the parking lot. Her daughter drove her every visit and never came in. Saturday out there in a gray Subaru for the full hour, engine off, estranged, the intake note said. When the session ended, the woman asked me quiet if I'd walk her out, and I did. And 20 feet from the car, the daughter looked up and I watched 2 people look at each other through a windshield, like it was 20 years of glass. I went home and I couldn't sleep, and it wasn't my heart. It was the certainty, sudden and physical, that I knew both seats of that Subaru. That week, I dug out Graham's floor plan, the one with the flower boxes, and I stopped treating my clinic like a someday. The hospital foundation runs a community grant, $50,000, 1 award a year. I wrote the application in 6 nights. The Margaret Project, outpatient cardiac rehabilitation for the rural county. Her name right there in the title where my mother would eventually have to read it. Even with the grant, I'd be 15000 short and undercapitalized, but it was a door, and I have learned to love an open door. I mailed it on a Tuesday. On Thursday, my father's heart finally did what hearts do when you feed them silence for 63 years. He went down at the farm supply store in H. Heartland between the fence wire and the bird seed, and the county ambulance brought him to us to my hospital, because it's the only cardiac program for 40 miles. A fact that is about to matter a great deal.
Not the Widowmaker, a smaller cousin.
The cath lab team threaded a stent into him inside an hour, and Frank Emerson, 63, got parked 2 floors below the unit where his daughter had nearly died in March, prescribed the standard gospel, medications, a cardiac diet, and 12 weeks of outpatient rehab, which is how I learned. reading the intake board on my Wednesday shift, that my father had been referred to the gym where I now worked. I stood there holding my coffee, appreciating God's sense of humor. And then the elevator opened, and for the first time in 3 years, my mother walked toward me down a hallway I was being paid to stand in. Carol Emerson, 61, church lunch and cardigan, purse held in both hands like a hymnal. I watched her assemble her face as she came. I know that assembly. I grew up under it. And what she landed on was warmth, actual blue ribbon warmth. "There you are," she said, as if I'd been misplaced, as if the last 3 years were weather that had inconvenienced us both equally. No mention of March, no glance at the scar edging above my collar. She took my hand in both of hers, and she smiled, the smile that ran 1,000 bake sales, and she said, "Family takes care of family, Dusty. It's time you came home." Hold on, because the same people who said I wasn't their problem were about to hand me theirs, gift wrapped. If your jaw is on the floor, hit subscribe, because the check they eventually put on that table deserves witnesses. She wasn't there to apologize. She was there to collect. She bought me a coffee in the hospital cafeteria, which I mentioned because she would mention it. And she laid out the plan with the serene efficiency of a woman reading a grocery list she'd already shopped. I would give up my apartment in Bangor and move back into my old room in Heartland. I would drive my father to his appointments, manage his medications, cook the cardiac diet, monitor his blood pressure, and generally be, in her words, what this family needs right now. Duration until your father is himself again, which in the Emerson calendar is a unit of time with no end printed on it. Salary, none. Obviously, the wage was belonging because your family are. I asked the natural question. Brianna lives 12 minutes from them. I live 40. Your sister has the children Dusty and Scott's in his busy season. Insurance has a busy season now. I didn't fight. I did something more dangerous to her plan. My job. I pulled out a pad and built my father an actual care structure, the one I'd build for any patient with his chart. A home health RN 3 mornings a week, through the cardiac agency we refer to. His rehab schedule at my own gym where I could personally watch his numbers, a pharmacist consult, a dietitian, the works. Better care than I could give him exhausted and resentful in a twin bed down the hall. I costed it out on the napkin. I offered to coordinate every piece of it. My mother looked at my napkin the way you'd look at a stranger's dog on your porch and pushed it back across the table with one finger. "We don't do strangers," she said, and I understood with a clarity that was almost restful. She didn't want care for him. She wanted me back in position. When I didn't move home by the weekend, the town began arriving in dishes. A chicken casserole appeared in the hospital break room with my name on a sticky note and a card from the St. John's Women's Circle praying, "You'll be there for your family in their hour of need." A cousin I hadn't heard from in 3 years, not during my surgery, not once, texted, "You're literally a nurse. It's nothing for you." My old Sunday school teacher called my personal phone, which meant somebody had given her the number and told me my mother had wept at the pharmacy counter. "Poor thing with everything she's carrying. I want you to see the machine clearly because it took me 3 decades. My mother never needs to win an argument. She just tells the story once at the right altitude, and the town repeats it until it hardens into weather. She is the narrator of H. Heartland, and the narrator decides who's selfish." Each casserole was a subpoena, and then Thursday I saw her without her knowing. I'd driven out to the H. Heartland pharmacy to pick up a prescription they'd botched transferring for a rehab patient. And through the front window I saw my mother at the counter alone, counting out my father's new pills against a printed list. Her lips moving, her finger trembling down the page, her shoulders. My mother has stood like a flagpole through funerals. Her shoulders were down. For a moment, she was just a 61-year-old woman, frightened, doing medical math alone. I almost went in. My hand was on the door. What stopped me wasn't anger, and I want to be honest about that. It was a question I couldn't put down. Who taught her this? Somebody builds every machine. I got back in my car and I drove home and I called Ruth. My father started rehab on a Tuesday. Professional ethics are real. I was not assigned to him. Denise took his file, but the gym is one room, and for an hour, 3 mornings a week. I existed 20 feet from my father while a monitor broadcast his heart rate over his head. Like a subtitle, he moved carefully, gray around the edges, obedient to every instruction in a way that told me how scared he was. Week 2. During his cool down, he drifted to the water fountain near where I was charting, and stood there too long for it to be about water. You always were the strong one, he said to the fountain. There it is, I thought. The compliment that runs the whole machine, the strong one. It sounds like love and it functions like a job assignment. They hand it to you young, and every kindness you perform after that gets filed under job description instead of gift. I looked up from the chart and asked him the only question I had left. Dad, why didn't you ever ask what happened to me in March? His eyes came up to mine and I watched the number over his head climb 4 beats. 5-6. His heart saying what the rest of him wouldn't. He looked at my collar where the scar shows. He opened his mouth, and what came out after all of it was, "Your mother handles the family things." Then he shuffled back to his machine. Like a man returning to a cell, he decorated himself. Ruth was right. He never asks what he already knows. And I finally understood the reason. A signature in blue ink, 12 years old, sitting in my nightstand drawer. Every question about me led back to it. And he knew that better than anyone alive. Brianna came to my apartment on a Sunday unannounced, holding a supermarket orchid and wearing the expression of a woman performing a chore her mother assigned. She led with the apology. That phone thing, I was joking. You know me, it came out wrong. And honestly, you're fine now. So my near death had been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Then she looked around my one-bedroom apartment like an appraiser and got to the actual agenda. Look, if you take Dad, the driving, the meals, all of it. Mom says the lake cottage goes to you someday. That's fair. That's basically getting paid. The cottage, Graham's little green cottage on Sebasticook, the one with the dock where she taught us both to fish. I asked Brianna carefully when Mom had started promising that cottage. And my sister, who has never once been careful, shrugged and told me the truth. She's always said it. I cleaned that place 2 whole summers in high school because she said it'd be mine if I kept it up. She heard it as she said it. I watched it land and she covered it fast with a laugh. But there it was out on the table between us. The cottage had been promised to both of us separately for years, dangled like a treat above whichever daughter was due to perform. My sister wasn't the architect of this economy. She was just holding different debt at a different interest rate. For 1 second, I genuinely pied her. Then she gathered her purse and delivered the exit line she'd clearly been sent with. Oh, and don't bring up that old money thing. Mom says the stress of it could kill Dad. I stood very still, they knew. All of them, all along. The fund wasn't a secret, it was a silence with a family seal on it. I took the question to the only historian I trust. Ruth and I sat on her porch with tea going cold, and I asked what my mother was like before I existed. Ruth rocked for a while. Carol Hutchkins, she said, using a maiden name I'd almost never heard, was 19 years old when her mother got sick. Her cancer, the slow kind. 2 older brothers, both grown, both gone. One to the service, one just gone. So Carol dropped her secretarial course, and for 2 years in that little house on Route 43, she fed her mother, bathed her mother, turned her mother in the night so the sores wouldn't start. Alone every single day, alone. Ruth looked out at the yard. I'd see her at the store. This girl gray as dishwater at 21. And at the funeral, her brothers showed up in pressed suits and split the land. And one of them clapped her on the shoulder and told her mother was lucky to have her. Lucky. Then they drove off and she got nothing. And nobody ever asked what those 2 years cost her. Not once. Not to this day. Ruth set her cup down. I'm not excusing your mother, child. I watched what she did to you, and I kept a coward's peace about it for too long. But you should know what you're actually fighting. She's not cruel for sport. She's a bill that never got paid, and she has spent 40 years passing it down. I sat with that grandmother to mother to me, the same stone handed down, and me at the rehab gym watching a stranger's daughter refuse it from a Subaru. Understanding where the knife was forged doesn't mean you hand it your throat, but it does tell you the knife was once a girl. The invitation arrived on proper cardstock because my mother sends artillery by mail. Sunday dinner, the whole family. Time we put things right. First invitation in 3 years. Then she called, actually called voice like warm honey over a spoon, and made the offer out loud. The family wanted to help with that little clinic of yours. There was, she said, a sum we've discussed. And then she named it $38,000. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, doing what I do in codes, going very calm while everything alarms. You should understand what that number meant. Not 40, not 35, 38. The exact figure written in my father's hand, in blue ink, in my nightstand drawer. A figure I had never once spoken to them. Brianna's warning suddenly had context. They knew Ruth had visited. They guessed what she'd finally delivered. And this was the response, not an apology, a buyback. They weren't offering me money. They were repurchasing the ledger and pricing it at face value, like no interest had accrued on my entire 20s. My mother kept talking smooth as a closing agent. There'd be things to discuss at dinner. Of course, the year you'll spend at home with your father. We'll work out the details, and sweetheart, we'll have no more digging up ancient history. It only hurts people. Graham wouldn't want that. There it was, whole and gleaming, the machine's best offer, everything I wanted wrapped around everything I'd escaped. I told her I'd come to dinner. I hung up and I stood looking at my nightstand for a long time. And I'll tell you the truth, for about an hour that night, with a rejected grant sitting in my inbox, I did the math on selling myself back to them. The math was excellent. It always is, because here's what that same week had delivered. The foundation email, regretting to inform me the grant went to a worthy telehealth project, and the Margaret project went back to being a floor plan with flower boxes. Without the grant, I needed roughly $65,000. I did not have, and here was my mother offering to close most of that gap with one signature. Take the check. The clinic opens in spring, Graham's name on the door. Done. Refuse it. A second mortgage on my condo if the bank even said yes. Years of risk. Maybe never. I spread it all on the kitchen table that night like a case file. The check that didn't exist yet. The grant rejection, Graham's letter. My father's note. Maya came over with takeout and watched me stare at it. She didn't lecture. She asked one question, the one we ask each other on the unit when a family can't decide about a surgery. If this were a patient, what would you tell her? And I heard my own voice answer before I could dress it up, that the surgery she's avoiding is the one she needs. Because I finally saw the shape of it. The money was real, but it wasn't the product. The product was me back in position. The strong one restored to her post. The story repaired for the town. The ledger reopened under new management. They weren't buying my clinic, they were buying my number. And Graham's letter sat there in the middle of the table saying the only sentence that had ever been entirely on my side. Don't you ever sign one. Sunday, I put the envelope in my bag and I drove to H. Heartland. They thought I was coming home. I was coming to say goodbye with the door open and my eyes clear. The house looked like a holiday. White tablecloth, the good dishes, a roast chicken my father wasn't supposed to eat, resting in the middle like a centerpiece. Brianna and Scott were already seated. The kids parked in the den with a movie. My father sat at his end of the table, thinner, his collar loose, his eyes doing the thing they'd done at the water fountain, arriving at me and leaving. And my mother was radiant. I mean that precisely. She had the glow of a woman about to solve something. 3 years of exile, a torn aorta, a brunch selfie. All of it had been swept off this table so completely that for one disorienting moment I doubted my own archive. That is her true gift. She doesn't deny the past. She simply sets a table where it would be rude to bring it up. We ate. Scott talked about premiums. Brianna narrated the children. My father said the chicken was good twice. And with the plates cleared and the coffee poured, my mother reached into the sideboard drawer and slid it across the tablecloth to me. Face up, the way you deal a card you'd been holding all night, a check. $38,000 drawn in her looping hand, signed, dated, real. And in the memo line, in her looping script, family for the clinic, she said, warm as the coffee. Graham would be so proud. Then, while my thumb was still on the paper, the terms gentle as a lullaby. Now we're thinking you'll give notice on the apartment by the 1st. Your old room's ready, a year, maybe less if Dad comes along, and all this old unpleasantness. Her hand made a small circle in the air, a gesture that included. I understood the fund, the letter, the phone call. March itself stays in the past where it belongs for Graham's sake. $38,000. My dream printed on their paper. All I had to do was become their daughter again. The one who pays. I didn't pick up the check and I didn't push it away. I left it on the tablecloth between us and I asked my question. The one I'd carried in on purpose. The way you carry one good instrument into a messy field. I kept my voice at the pitch I use for medication instructions because that's the voice nobody can call hysterical. Before I answer, I want to know one thing. If I had died on that table in March, what would you have told the church I was? The room stopped. Scott's cup paused halfway. My father looked at his plate as if the pattern had changed, and my mother blinked once, the single blink of a machine encountering an input outside its parameters. That's a morbid thing to ask at dinner, she said. I waited. Waiting is a clinical skill. Silence pulls truth the way suction pulls fluid. It was Brianna who broke, of course. Brianna defensive, half laughing, reaching for the same tool that had worked at the cafe. Oh my God, this is what I meant. She makes everything so dramatic as for God's sake she's not art. And she stopped right there. The sentence sat in her open mouth with its shoes off, and she heard it, really heard it. Maybe for the first time, because the last time she said it, I was on a table with my chest open, and everyone at this one knew it. She put her fork down and looked at her plate. Nobody finished the sentence for her. That silence was the most honest thing my family had said to me in 3 years. My mother recovered first because she always does. She smoothed the tablecloth with one palm professional as an undertaker and smiled. We're looking forward, sweetheart, not back. So I reached into my bag and I set Graham's envelope on the white cloth, and nobody at that table moved to touch it. You all know what this is, I said, and their faces confirmed it. Brianna's warning. My mother's exact figure. My father's eyes closing slowly like a man hearing a verdict he'd already served. So, I'll keep it simple. I slid the check back across the tablecloth, uncashed, onto right side up until it touched my mother's saucer. I'm not selling, and I'm done being owed. Then I did the thing none of them could have predicted because it had taken me 34 years and one torn artery to predict it myself. I took out Graham's letter and my father's note. The originals, my only copies, the whole archive of what they did. And I laid them beside the check, a gift, not a strike. Graham kept the ledger so I wouldn't have to. I'm returning it. As far as I'm concerned, the ledger's closed. My mother's hand came down flat over the papers, fast, an instinct securing them, and I watched her realize what the instinct confessed and take the hand back. I turned to my father, and I used the voice I'd use with any patient because it's the kindest one I own. Dad, you have an appointment with Dr. Levin in Portland on the 14th, 10 a.m. Best cardiac rehab specialist in the state. I called in the referral Friday. There is a home health RN scheduled 3 mornings a week for the first month. The paperwork's on the hall. You will get excellent care. I stood up and pushed in my chair because Graham raised me to push in chairs. You're right about one thing, Mom. Family takes care of family. That's exactly what I'm doing. Starting with the family that showed up. My mother's voice when it came had lost the honey and found something old and flinty under it. If you walk out that door, don't you ever come back. Scott muttered a word I won't repeat, aimed at me, and the check lay there on the white cloth between the coffee cups, face up, like a knife nobody would claim. I was at the front door with my coat half on when I heard it. Not shouted, cracked. My mother's voice split down a seam I had never once heard fail, and out of it came the first true sentence she had said to me in years, maybe decades. And who takes care of me? I stopped. My hand was on the same doorknob I'd turned as a 6-year-old. Behind me, I could hear the kitchen clock and Brianna not breathing, and I understood that I was hearing the engine of my whole family idling in one question. A 19-year-old girl on Route 43, spooning broth alone at 2 inches the morning, watching her brother's headlights leave. She was standing in that dining room doorway, 61 years old, still waiting for her turn, and so certain it would never come that she'd spent 40 years collecting the debt from her daughters instead. I didn't turn around. If I'd turned around, I'd have gone to her and we'd have started the machine again with my grief as fuel. Someone should have, Mom, I said, a long time ago, and I'm sorry no one did, but it was never supposed to be your daughters' whole lives. It's not going to be mine. Then I walked out and the storm door swung itself shut behind me, unhurried, like even the house knew. Monday morning at 9, I sat in a bank office in Bangor and signed a 7-year loan against my condo, my hand, my collateral, my risk, and Ruth, who'd insisted on coming, slid her own check across the desk for a 20% partnership stake before I could argue. Margaret would haunt me otherwise, she said, and dared the loan officer to comment. The clinic would open with my name on the debt and my aunt's name on the door schedule. And the Emersons of H. Heartland would open something too, a new edition of the story with me as the villain. I decided to let them keep it. The bill for my choice arrived on schedule in installments. A voicemail from my mother, tone freshly ironed, informing the family record. After everything, she threw money in her sick father's face and walked out. We're praying for her. A text from the casserole cousin. How could you humiliate your mother like that after everything she's been through? The women's circle went quiet. No more chicken in the break room. In H. Heartland's official weather report, I was now the daughter who'd assaulted a grieving household with a check. And here is the part I'm proudest of more than the clinic. More than anything, I corrected no one. Not one reply, not one receipts thread, not one carefully worded post. The old me needed to be believed the way lungs need air. I used to think being believed was oxygen. Turns out it was just another invoice. One more debt I was working off to people who were never going to market paid. I let the town keep Carol's edition. I knew the truth. The 2 other people who mattered had written it and witnessed it. That was quorum. And then 10 days after the dinner, Ruth handed me a piece of paper at her kitchen table, and I recognized the blue ink before I understood the words. My father's handwriting. No apology, no explanation, no signature line for feelings. Just kept the appointment with Dr. Lean, keeping the next one too, fee. The same hand that signed a debt he never repaid. Now signing attendance. It wasn't restitution. It was a man doing one honest rep at a time. The only way hearts or people ever actually rebuild. I put it in the nightstand drawer where the ledger used to live. Winter came and went. In April, we hung a sign. The Margaret Center Cardiac Rehab and Recovery opened on a Tuesday in the 13th of April, months after my aorta tried to kill me in a renovated storefront in Bangor with flower boxes under the front windows because the blueprint demanded them. 22 patients enrolled the first month. Farm wives and retired mill workers and one stubborn lobsterman. People who used to drive 90 minutes for what's now down the road. Maya works 2 evenings a week. Ruth runs the front desk with postal discipline. She has already alphabetized things I didn't know could be alphabetized. And on the second Friday, the door chimed and my father walked in through the front door as a patient holding his transfer paperwork from Dr. Levin, like a hall pass. He filled out the intake forms in the waiting room chair. Same as everyone, where the form asked for an emergency contact. I watched him pause, pen hovering, and then write, Ruth Emerson, sister. He's learning too in his own currency. His check arrives on the 1st of every month. $500, memo line blank, no note. I don't keep it. It goes straight into the scholarship fund we set up in Graham's name for local nursing students. Every dollar. His debt was never mine to collect. It belongs to the next generation now, which is the only direction a debt like that can honestly travel. My mother has never seen the clinic. Brianna drives her to church every Sunday. Now I hear things through Ruth, and I recognize the shape of my sister's new schedule, the way you recognize a diagnosis. The machine didn't die, it just lost my address. Some Sundays I feel the pull of that empty chair at that white tablecloth. Then a patient walks in scared and I pull up a different chair and it passes. There is a card in my wallet now laminated because Ruth laminates things. It says, in case of emergency, contact Ruth Emerson, Aunt Maya, Taurus sister by choice. The woman who once sat in a telemetry bed, unable to fill in 2 blank lines, knows those lines by heart today. That's the whole distance I traveled. If you're measuring 4 minutes of paperwork and 34 years of permission, my sister turned out to be right about one thing, and I've stopped resenting the sentence. I'm not their problem anymore. But then I never was a problem. I was the collateral, and collateral doesn't get asked how it's feeling. It just gets held against the loan. Not anymore. The ledger sits in a drawer in H. Heartland, now in a house I don't visit. And I hope some night my mother reads Graham's letter all the way to the end, because the last line was never only for me. Graham was right, and it's the one piece of wisdom I'll leave you with. Love that keeps a ledger isn't love. So pay what you owe to the people who never kept one, and let the rest of the accounting die with the house that built it. The brunch selfie, the envelope with 2 pieces of paper, the $38,000 check I slid back across my mother's tablecloth. Some families hand you love, and some hand you a bill, and sometimes you don't learn which one you've got until you're on the table. If you've ever had to learn the difference the hard way, tell me your story in the comments. I read everyone, and subscribe to Hidden Family Revenge, because next week's story cuts even deeper.